A year later, David turned 14. Margaret managed, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to take a single day off work to celebrate it properly, a decision that would have been unthinkable to her a year earlier, when every hour of unpaid time off felt like a debt she couldn't afford. They didn't go anywhere expensive. They simply spent the day together without either of them watching the clock, without either of them calculating what the day was costing them that they couldn't spare. At one point, quietly, without any particular occasion for it, David asked her, "Do you still think about it, what I did?" Margaret thought about the question for a long moment before answering. "Every day," she said, "not because I'm angry, because I think about how alone you must have felt watching me, keeping that notebook, deciding you had to save me by yourself. I think about how long you carried that before anyone else knew." David didn't say anything for a while. Then he reached across the table and took her hand, the same way she had once held his, walking him to his first day of school before either of them had any idea what the years ahead would ask of them. Outside, the first snow of the new winter had just begun to fall, quiet and steady, the same as it had the year everything changed. But inside, this time the heater was working, the kitchen was warm, and the notebook sat where it always did now, in plain sight on the table, no longer a secret, no longer something either of them had to carry alone. What people who only read the newspaper article never learned was what happened to some of the smaller figures in this story, the ones who appeared for only a moment and who nonetheless carried the weight of that courtroom morning with them long afterward. Judge Patricia Nkemelu retired 18 months after the hearing, after 21 years on the bench. In her retirement remarks delivered to a small room of colleagues and clerks, she did not mention Margaret or David by name out of respect for their privacy, but she spoke briefly about a case that had reminded her why she had left social work for law in the first place, all those years earlier. She said that the law at its best was not a machine for punishment, but a tool that human beings were trusted to wield with judgment, and that she hoped whoever replaced her would remember that a courtroom was still, first and always, a room full of people. Eric Halden left the pharmacy chain 2 years later to help open a small independent pharmacy in the same neighborhood, one with a formal, permanent policy of working with any patient who could not afford their medication to find some kind of solution before ever involving the police. He kept a framed copy of Alicia Quann's newspaper article on the wall behind the counter, not to draw attention to himself, but as a daily reminder of the morning he had stood up in that courtroom and the years he had spent before that morning filing reports because policy told him to, without asking himself what the policy actually cost the people on the other side of the counter. Rosa, the neighbor who had looked after David during the 2 nights of his mother's arrest, continued to check in on the family for years afterward, in the quiet, unremarkable way of someone who considers a kindness simply a normal part of living near other people. She never spoke of those 2 nights again, not because they didn't matter to her, but because she understood, in a way many people never fully learn, that some kindnesses are diminished by being discussed too often. Lynn, Margaret's sister, eventually convinced Margaret to move along with David into a small guest house behind Lynn's home, at a rent so far below market value that it was, in every honest sense, another form of the help Margaret had spent so many years refusing to accept. This time, she accepted it. It took nearly a year of gentle, repeated offers before she did, and even then she insisted on paying what she could on her own schedule, refusing to let the arrangement become, in her mind, another debt she could not repay. The larger world's reaction to the story, once it spread beyond the regional newspaper, was neither entirely kind nor entirely cruel, the way most things that spread widely online tend to be. There were people who wrote long, thoughtful comments about the failures of a healthcare and wage system that could force a mother into this position in the first place. There were people who argued bitterly in the comment sections beneath the article about whether David had done the right thing, threads that stretched into the hundreds of replies, strangers arguing passionately about a family they had never met and never would. There were inevitably a handful of people who accused Margaret of manipulating the story for sympathy, who suggested that any mother willing to steal in front of a security camera must have wanted to be caught, must have staged the entire episode for effect. Margaret never read most of these comments. David read a few of them early on before Margaret found out and gently asked him to stop looking. "It's not worth caring what strangers think of us," she told him. "We know what happened. That has to be enough." There were also, in smaller and quieter numbers, people who reached out directly, not to argue or theorize, but simply to say that they recognized themselves in the story: other mothers rationing medication, other children keeping careful, frightened watch over a parent they loved too much to say anything about their fear out loud. A woman in another state wrote to Margaret through the newspaper's contact form to say that reading about the notebook had finally given her the courage to tell her own teenage daughter the truth about how bad their finances had become, rather than continuing to hide it the way Margaret once had. Margaret kept that particular letter in a drawer and read it again occasionally on the hardest days, as a reminder that the worst chapter of her life had, in some small way, made someone else's chapter a little easier to bear. David's relationship with the notebook itself changed slowly over the following 2 years. For a long time after the hearing, he could not look at it without a knot forming in his stomach, a physical memory of the fear that had driven him to keep it in the first place. His therapist, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Alan Reyes who worked with the community clinic Lynn had helped them access, encouraged him gently to write in it still, but differently now, not as surveillance of his mother's suffering, but simply as a record of ordinary life, the way any teenager might keep a journal. The entries changed accordingly. March 2nd, Mom laughed today, really laughed at something stupid I said about my math teacher. I haven't heard that laugh in a long time. I wrote it down because I didn't want to forget what it sounded like. May 9th, Aunt Lynn taught me how to make her dumplings today. Mom cried a little watching us, but it was a good kind of crying. She said it reminded her of her own mother, who she barely remembers. July 4th, we went to a fireworks show for the first time in years. Mom didn't have to work a double shift that day. She sat on a blanket in the grass and didn't look tired once the whole night. Entries like these began to fill the notebook alongside the old, harder ones which David never tore out, choosing instead to let both kinds of memory sit together on the same pages, proof of how far they had come without pretending the earlier chapter had never happened. 2 years after the hearing, David, now 14 and about to start high school, was asked by his English teacher to write an essay about a person who had changed his life. Most of his classmates wrote about grandparents, coaches, older siblings. David wrote about his mother, though he changed enough small details at her request that the essay could never be traced back to the newspaper article that had briefly made their private pain into public conversation. In the essay, he wrote about watching her work 2 jobs without complaint, about the quiet dignity of a woman who had spent her whole life believing that suffering silently was the only kind of strength worth having, and about the harder, more important lesson she had eventually taught him without meaning to, that real strength sometimes looks like admitting out loud to the people who love you that you cannot carry everything alone. His teacher, reading the essay late one evening at her kitchen table, cried before she finished it, and gave David the only perfect score she awarded that semester, along with a note in the margin that said simply, "Thank you for trusting me with this." Margaret read the essay too eventually after David worked up the courage to show her, nearly a month after he had turned it in. She read it twice in silence at the same kitchen table where so much of the story had unfolded, and when she finished, she didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, she looked up at her son and said, "I used to think I failed you by letting things get so bad that you felt like you had to save me yourself." David shook his head. "You didn't fail me," he said. "You just didn't know yet that you didn't have to do it alone. Neither of us did." There is no perfectly tidy way to end this story, because real families rarely arrive at perfectly tidy endings. Margaret still occasionally catches herself falling into old patterns, offering David the larger portion at dinner, insisting she isn't hungry when she clearly is before catching herself and correcting course, a small, private battle against 25 years of learned self-erasure that she expects to keep fighting for the rest of her life. David still occasionally wakes in the middle of the night out of old habit, listening for the sound of his mother's voice through the wall, before remembering that there is no debt collector on the phone anymore, no quiet crying to overhear, only the ordinary silence of a house where 2 people finally are not hiding anything significant from each other. The notebook still sits on the kitchen table, worn now at the corners, filled with a strange and moving mixture of a boy's early terror and a family's slow, imperfect healing. Neither of them has ever suggested putting it away, out of sight, in some drawer or box reserved for painful memories. It stays where it is, in plain view, a physical reminder of the year a 12-year-old boy loved his mother so fiercely, and so desperately that he was willing to risk everything, including her forgiveness, to keep her alive. Whether he was right to do what he did remains, and likely always will remain, a question without a single correct answer. But somewhere in that uncertainty lies the truest part of the story, that love, real love, the kind that survives 25 years of hardship and a single desperate phone call, rarely arrives in the form anyone expects and rarely resolves itself as neatly as the stories we tell about it. Sometimes it looks like a boy with a notebook under a floorboard. Sometimes it looks like a mother finally letting someone else carry part of the weight. And sometimes, on the coldest nights of the year, it simply looks like two people sitting quietly at the same kitchen table, no longer alone. There is one more piece of this story Margaret rarely tells. Roughly 3 years after the arrest, a letter arrived from Thomas, David's father, sober now, asking quietly if he could be part of David's life again in whatever small way David might allow. Margaret didn't tell David what to think of it. "That's not my decision to make," she told him. "This is about you and him." David wrote back, honest but cautious, not ready to call him anything more than the man who had left, but not closing the door forever either. It became, over the following years, a slow and occasional correspondence. Nothing more, nothing resolved, simply present in the background of their lives, the way old wounds sometimes stay, neither fully healed nor fully reopened. The hardest conversation Margaret and David ever had, harder even than the ones immediately following the hearing, came almost 2 years after the arrest, on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, when David finally asked her the question he had been carrying since he was 12 years old. "That night," he said, "when I heard you on the phone talking about the life insurance, were you thinking about hurting yourself, or did you mean it some other way?" Margaret did not answer quickly. She had known for 2 years that this question was somewhere ahead of them, waiting, and she had privately practiced 100 different answers, none of which had ever felt honest enough. "I don't fully know," she finally said. "I wasn't planning anything specific, not that night, not any night. But I had stopped being able to imagine a version of my life getting better. And when a person stops being able to imagine that, sometimes the only comfort they can find is imagining that their absence might do more good than their presence. I know now how dangerous that kind of thinking is. I didn't understand it as clearly back then. I only knew I was exhausted in a way that felt permanent." David was quiet for a long time after she said this. Then he asked, "Do you still feel that way, ever?" "Rarely," she said. "Not the way I did then. But I won't pretend the thought never crosses my mind on the hardest days, because that wouldn't be honest, and I promised myself after everything that happened that I would try to be honest with you, even about the difficult parts." "If you ever feel that way again," David said, his voice unsteady, "please tell someone, please tell me. I don't want to have to guess again. I don't want another notebook." Margaret promised him that she would. It was not a promise she made lightly, and it was not one either of them treated as a small thing. In the years that followed, she kept it, more than once reaching out to Lynn, to her therapist, to David himself, on nights when the old exhaustion crept back in, rather than carrying it silently the way she once had for 25 years. By the time David turned 16, the family had settled into something that resembled, for the first time in either of their memories, an ordinary life. Margaret had, with Lynn's help, transitioned out of the laundromat job into a more stable position, managing inventory for a small local business, work that paid modestly more and asked considerably less of her body and her exhausted hours. She still was not wealthy, not by any measure, but she was no longer choosing, each week, between her son's medication and the electric bill. David had grown into a quieter, steadier version of the watchful boy he had once been, though something of that old vigilance never fully left him. His friends noticed sometimes that he checked in on people more carefully than most 16-year-olds bothered to, that he noticed when someone at the lunch table seemed unusually tired or unusually quiet, and asked about it gently, the way he had once learned, out of necessity, to read the emotional weather of his own home. He decided that year that he wanted to study social work, following, without quite realizing the echo of it, the same early career path that Judge Nkemelu had once taken before she became a lawyer and eventually a judge. When Margaret asked him why, he said simply, "I want to help families before things get as bad as they got for us. I want to be the kind of person who notices earlier than I did." Margaret cried when he told her this, not out of sadness, but out of something harder to name, a complicated pride in a son who had turned his own private suffering into something he hoped might spare other children the same fear he had once carried alone under a floorboard. If you have listened this far, you have spent nearly an hour inside the private, complicated interior of one family's hardest year and the slow, imperfect years that followed it. There is no simple moral offered here, no tidy lesson meant to wrap the story into something easily summarized. What remains instead is a single, quiet observation, offered without any claim to being the final word on the matter. Sometimes the people who love us most make choices we do not understand in the moment. Choices that look, from the outside, like betrayal or coldness or fear mistaken for cruelty. And sometimes, if we are patient enough and honest enough and willing enough to sit with the discomfort of not immediately understanding, those choices reveal themselves, later, as some of the most complete expressions of love a frightened child or a frightened parent ever managed to offer. David never fully resolved, even years later, whether calling the police that day had been the right decision. Margaret never fully resolved whether she should have told her son the truth sooner, rather than letting him discover it alone in fragments hidden beneath a floorboard. What they did resolve, slowly, painfully, and together, was this: that whatever mistakes either of them made along the way, they had, in the end, chosen each other again and again in the only ways they knew how, at the time they knew how to make them. And perhaps that, more than any tidy resolution, is the truest ending this story has to offer. Years later, when David was in his second year of college studying social work, exactly as he had planned at 16, he was asked by a professor to present a case study to his class, something drawn from personal experience that had shaped his understanding of the field. He hesitated for a long time before deciding to share, in careful, anonymized terms, the story of a mother and son he described only as clients he had once known. He did not tell his classmates it was his own life. He watched them discuss it, debate it, argue about whether the son in the story had done the right thing, exactly the way strangers on the internet once had, years earlier, without any of them ever knowing they were discussing the professor's own quietly proud student. Afterward, walking back to his dormitory in the cold evening air, David called his mother, the way he did most weeks by then, simply to talk. "How was your day?" she asked him, the way she always did. "Good," he said. "I taught a room full of people about you today. They didn't know it was you, but I did." Margaret, on the other end of the line in the small kitchen of the guest house behind her sister's home, smiled to herself, in a way David couldn't see but somehow still understood. "I hope you told them the good parts too," she said, "not just the hard ones." "I told them all of it," David said, "because that's what actually happened. The hard parts and the good parts were never really separate. They were just one story all along." Margaret didn't answer right away. When she finally did, her voice was quiet but steady in a way it had not always been, all those years earlier in a kitchen with a broken heater, holding a small white box she couldn't afford. "Then I suppose we told it right," she said. And somewhere in that simple exchange, between a mother who had once carried everything silently and a son who had once carried a notebook full of quiet fear, the story finally arrived at the only ending either of them had ever really needed. Not a perfect resolution, not a neat lesson, but two people, still choosing each other, still talking, still, after everything, not alone. It is worth pausing, before this story truly ends, to consider the ordinary people who moved briefly through it and then disappeared back into their own separate lives, each one changed in some small way by their proximity to Margaret and David's hardest year. The pharmacist who felt sick the moment he filed his report. The judge who chose quietly to read a child's private notebook aloud rather than force that child to relive it himself. The neighbor who asked no questions and simply made dinner for 2 nights. The sister who let 4 years of silence dissolve the moment pride no longer mattered more to her than love. The reporter who could have written a colder, more sensational version of this story, and chose not to. The stranger who left an envelope in a mailbox with no name attached, asking for nothing in return. None of them set out to be part of anyone else's story. They were simply living their own lives, going about their own ordinary days, when a moment arrived asking something small but significant of them, and each of them, in their own way, chose to give it. This, perhaps, is the quieter lesson beneath the louder question of whether David was right to call the police. It is not only about one boy's impossible decision. It is about how many small, unremarkable choices made by people who will likely never meet each other again can gather together around a single struggling family and, without any of them fully realizing it, keep that family from falling any further than it already had. Margaret did not survive that year because of any single dramatic rescue. She survived it because of a pharmacist's guilty conscience, a judge's old memory of social work, a sister's overdue apology, a stranger's quiet envelope, and most of all because of a frightened 12-year-old boy who loved her enough to make an impossible choice on her behalf, even not knowing at the time whether it was the right one. If there is one thing worth carrying away from Margaret and David's story, it may simply be this: look closely at the people around you. Notice the untouched dinner plate, the coat worn too thin for winter, the silence where complaints used to be. You may never know from the outside whether someone nearby is quietly disappearing the same way Margaret once was. But the noticing itself, the willingness to ask, to sit beside someone in their exhaustion rather than looking away from it, may be worth more than any of us realize, until the day we are the ones who finally need to be noticed ourselves. Margaret herself, asked once what she would say to another parent standing exactly where she once stood, decided after everything not to speak in terms of exact answers because there are none simple enough to fit every family. Instead, she said this: "If you feel yourself disappearing, say it out loud to someone before a child has to write it down in secret to keep track of you. That notebook still sits on our kitchen table." It is the one thing in this whole story I would never ask anyone to take away.